Hello, thanks for listening to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, where we share insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you stay ahead of the curve. Our conversations happen where disruptive technology meets human intelligence, so this should be useful whatever sector you work in and wherever in the world you do it. From our London office, I'm Sonia Rothwell. In this episode, building a privacy culture to drive success. We'll be talking about data privacy and cybersecurity with today's expert guest, Aaron Weller, Vice President of Strategy at Sentinel LLC. We'll answer questions like, how can you build a working culture that includes a respect for data privacy? How data privacy affects accountancy and finance professionals? And what does Aaron think could be the next big disruption on the horizon in this area? You can find links and more information in the show notes for this episode or by going to gobeyonddisruption.com. Let's get started with this week's conversation. Aaron Weller is a corporate and enterprise privacy strategist working across the tech and retail sectors in the US. Aaron has over 20 years of information security and privacy experience. After 5 years leading PwC's privacy practice for the Western US, Aaron spent a year leading the GDPR program management office for a leading technology company and now advises their chief compliance officer on privacy strategy. Aaron also provides strategic privacy advice to companies looking to innovate their use of personal information. Aaron has been a member of the IAPP certification training faculty for 6 years. In recognition of his leadership in the field of privacy, Aaron was accepted as a Fellow of Information Privacy, an FIP, in 2016. Aaron is the perfect expert guest to give us the inside track on data privacy and cybersecurity and about how ethical companies attract better people, which means more customers are reassured to stay. Aaron, where are you joining us from today?
So I'm just outside Seattle, a little town called Redmond that you've probably heard of as where Microsoft is based.
A little town where a big company is based. We've said quite a lot about you and your work already. So what have we left out? What else are you working on and how does it connect with our topic of cybersecurity today?
So some of the things that I'm working on are both looking at the laws that are in place right now and how companies need to try and change their processes to comply, but also then looking forwards as well. So we're in a period of pretty rapid change in terms of how we're using personal information. And the laws and then the practices that organizations have trying to kind of keep up with the way that society is moving. So it's a very interesting space. And I'm working on everything from a policy on when you can use drones and kind of what the footage should be used for to some things around facial recognition and what's the right balance between using them for things like theft prevention, whereas at the same time protecting people's rights. So a lot of things that are all around that same topic area, but different aspects that play out in different ways.
Do you think that the law and the laws around the world are keeping up with the technology?
It's interesting because the technology moves so fast, and as I think we all appreciate, laws generally don't get changed all that often. We're seeing a trend of a lot of laws trying to be technology agnostic. So the GDPR, which came out in Europe last year, 2018, really they were looking at this law being in place for 20 to 30 years without substantial changes. So when you go and read through the law, there's a lot of talk around the kinds of things that you do with the information, but not really anything getting into the technical nuances, which is very different from a lot of the requirements that we're familiar with from a cybersecurity perspective, which really get into the very technical details. So I think lawmakers are trying to see, technology is moving very fast. And really the only answer to that from a legal perspective is to try and put in place something that provides an overall framework and some principles, and then leave the nuances up to the courts and the regulators kind of as the technology develops.
So it's quite nimble. It's quite a dynamic way of producing regulations now. Now, your core expertise is cybersecurity. Why did you develop your skills in this direction, and how do you use them in the work you're doing today?
It's a funny story, really. I was working in internal audit at one of the big accounting firms, and we acquired, this was kind of back in, 1999, we acquired a group of people from another big company that were a security team. And this was right back when cybersecurity was just kind of in its nascent stage. And I was fascinated by the work they did. I knew very little about it, but my background was, I'd done computer programming in college and I had some interest in it, but I didn't really have any expertise. So I got into it through basically saying, look, I'll do what it takes. Just teach me how this stuff works, so that I can eventually one day be doing some of those things. And really it snowballed from there. So I started off from not really knowing anything, and then a few years later ended up running security teams. So it was just something I was passionate about and followed my passion.
So how do you use them in what you're doing today?
I'm more in the privacy side of cyber these days, where really looking at how the data is used rather than necessarily how it's protected. But I think having that background of the technical nuances, understanding how networks work, a lot of the things that cybersecurity is just core to kind of how you do that role. It's useful to me when I'm in conversations, particularly with lawyers, where you're looking at how a law is actually going to be implemented in an organization. And I have enough of that knowledge to say, oh, well, if we do it this way, then it's probably going to cause problems over here, or we're trying to achieve this goal. There's probably a there's probably a tool that the security team has that would allow us to go and do that and to do it in an efficient way.
Now, we've called this episode Building a Privacy Culture to Drive Success. What do you think that says about why this topic is so important right now?
Privacy, as we'd say in the US, is really, it's at the forefront of a lot of people's thinking right now. There's a lot of news articles. We've seen some fairly significant issues with companies where sometimes they've broken the law, sometimes they haven't, but they've done things that are not necessarily very ethical with the way that data's been used. So I think that from me and from the clients that I'm working with, it's really thinking about how do we go beyond just compliance? Because I think you talk to anyone in the security space and they will say, well, you can be compliant, but not necessarily secure. And really with privacy and kind of, I would expand that to being really data usage. It's the same kind of thing. You could be compliant with the laws, but not necessarily be doing things in a way that your customers, your employees, the regulators, other stakeholders are going to look at and say, that's a good thing to do. And it's something that really is in line with your overall values. So for me, it's going beyond compliance, and really the tagline of my company is culture, not compliance, because we feel that culture is what happens when management isn't looking, whereas compliance is something that only happens when you're in the process, going and checking a box. So for us, kind of building that culture is really thinking about how do you use personal information in a way that is not just legally compliant, but also meets all of these other obligations or commitments that your organization makes, whether it's directly to customers, to regulators, whether it's really the ethical commitments that you're making as an organization. We feel that all of that's part of the culture. And that's something that if you go after building that culture and kind of building it with all of those aspects, you've got a much higher chance of not having, an instant where you end up in the press for doing something you shouldn't have done.
That's really interesting because it covers the idea that if you think that you're doing one thing correctly, you may be exposing yourself on another point. And I suppose it's where some companies can add value to their clients, can't they, by going beyond what is expected of them?
There's always a trade-off, right? Because as soon as you say to any company that, well, we can go beyond what the minimum bar is, sometimes they're going to say, well, we only want to spend the money that's going to get us that minimum bar. And I think that can be a short-sighted approach because, you're then spending the money over and over. We look at it kind of one of the things that I consult on is what I call the sawtooth effect, where you have an organization where you have someone in charge of a security or privacy program, that they do a good job, the program gets better and better, and then they leave. And because that culture doesn't exist in the organization, you go back to square one effectively, and then you start that next sawtooth. So one of the things that I try and do with my clients is to say, look, there could be a short-term benefit in spending less money. I get that, that's the reality of the modern business world. But really, if you look over the medium to long term, putting in a little bit of extra effort and really thinking about how do you drive this into just the way the organization does business is probably going to be more valuable and beneficial in the long run.
It's October 2019, which means it's Cybersecurity Month, both in the US and here in Europe. But there's a lot of information out there. And I think that what you're talking about there is the value that your particular company brings to this very, very crowded marketplace. How would you, in a nutshell, explain the value that your company brings that makes it different to everybody else out there?
A lot of the stuff that we do is very much helping people who are running programs to both build those programs and then operate them in a very strategic way. So I like to look beyond just as I say, kind of that compliance piece that many programs get stuck on, and really help organizations to think about how do you build a network of stakeholders across the organization that are actually going to align with the efforts that you're putting forwards as part of your program. And then how do you really effectively sell, and I'm using air quotes, but sell that program internally to executive management to really see that value. So the place that my organization plays is really try to help those people, because I've been in those positions. I've run security and privacy programs. I know the kinds of stuff that you have to do day to day, but you're probably familiar about the difference between something being important and being urgent. The urgent stuff, kind of the screaming baby, those things that need to happen in the moment get the attention. And the important stuff, I'd include strategy in that, are the things that always get pushed to the backside. So I would say that really where I think that what I'm doing differently, and kind of particularly differently through the use of the technology platform that we're building, going beyond what I was doing strategic consulting for some of my previous roles, we're really trying to help the people who run programs do that better. I think there's a lot of people in the market who are really helping people to comply better and to go and get into some of those technical nuances of, how do I go and solve for a particular security control? There's not really many people who've had the experience to help business leaders in these spaces do a better job of having an overall better program and to avoid that sawtooth effect, as I mentioned previously. So
you're helping people to explain the value and the benefits of this approach. You're in some ways helping them advocate.
That's a good way of putting it. I mean, I look at it as a lot of people, when they're presenting kind of metrics and KPIs, they're always backwards looking and they're always activity focused. Hey, we did training for 75 people. Well, that's great. But what if the 75 people that you trained didn't actually make fewer mistakes than the 75 people you didn't train? I think really focusing on those outcomes and how your program is driving towards achieving outcomes rather than just turning the handle and getting stuff done. That's really, I think, that nuance that we really help organizations kind of pull out. And I'm working with some Fortune 100 companies now on really how do we really think about presenting to the board in a different way that's going to show how the security and privacy and some of these other risk management programs are actually very aligned with corporate strategy, because, people say that, every company is a data company these days. And if that's really true, then a lot of the things that you're doing with data and personal information, they are strategic. And I think saying that, we've got a compliance program that has all these checks and things that stop you doing what you want to with data, that doesn't really align with a lot of how organizations really see their strategy. So what we do is try and help the leaders of those teams have more of a business-centric viewpoint that balances all of those factors so that you're not just being the guy that never gets asked to the table, but you're really having a good seat at the table where you can show how the work that you do really supports the other stakeholders, your peers in the organization, ultimately the business strategy.
Disruption never stops. Things have always been changing. Take us back a few years. What did you think was the last big disruption that you saw in the industry, and what did it mean for the organizations that you were working with back then?
There's been disruption. It depends how far you want to go back. I remember year 2000 being pretty disruptive, but that's a pretty long time ago. I think a lot of disruption came around probably 2-3 years ago when the Europeans made it clear that they were being serious about completely changing all of their privacy laws and imposing these requirements with extraterritorial aspects. So a lot of organizations in the US, even if they didn't have physical locations in Europe, really had to understand, okay, what are the Europeans saying with this new general data protection regulation, and what do we need to do to comply? And I think one of the things where that really was disruptive is, it started with Europe, but we've seen this cascading chain of events, even into the US, where the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, is driving a lot of those same kind of ideas that GDPR had into the US domestic market. So now we're seeing organizations that don't even have any customers or any presence in Europe at all, having to then go and re-engineer their systems. And I think the disruptive piece was that privacy programs, if you go back 5 or 10 years, you had someone in charge, you had a training program, you'd have a privacy notice. A lot of it seemed very procedural. These new laws in the last 3 or 4 years, and if you look forwards towards potential future laws, it's the same kind of thing. They have very, very strong technical requirements. And I think that's where people who, organizations where their privacy teams were largely staffed by lawyers, they kind of got a little bit flat-footed with, okay, now we've got these requirements that require us to know where is all the data about an individual? How do we delete it if somebody asks? All of these things require a lot of systems talking to each other and a lot of real technical requirements around APIs and kind of how do you validate who someone is, who they say they are. That really, if you go back 5 years, none of that stuff was really built into the way we think about designing systems. So I think that was a very major disruption that started in one place. But now if I'm designing a new system, I need to think about, okay, do I have a unique reference point that somebody can look at and say, yep, that's Aaron, and I know it's this Aaron as opposed to a different one. Can I delete Aaron's data if I need to across potentially thousands of systems? I think that's a very big disruption because we've talked about technical debt for a number of years where, technology is not keeping up with the latest trends. I think most organizations have come to realize they also have data debt as well. The data is siloed. It's not all in the same place. It's not all in the same format, the same quality. Makes it really, really hard to comply with these laws. And I think that's been a big disruption because the laws never really had that much of an impact on down in the actual data before. So to me, it has been and continues to be this very major shift in the way the industry thinks about it.
And it's being used as well. It's not just been put on the statute books and been left there as a warning. It's actually being used.
Yeah, I mean, we've started to see some very significant fines. And I think what you don't see in the press as well, but kind of what I hear from the inside of the industry, there's a lot more activity going on where there aren't any fines, where the regulators are saying, hey, you're doing this, please stop doing this or do it in a slightly different way. So I think the regulators are still learning what their new powers are. But at the same time, organizations they're seeing the fines, but they're also seeing the way the industry is moving. And I think the winds have changed more broadly. And I'm seeing organizations start to look ahead and say, hey, even if we don't need to do this right now, should we? Should we go beyond what the law actually says and provide, these data subject rights, access, delete, all the rest of it to people where the law doesn't cover them today, but we expect them to tomorrow? Right? That's a bit of a change as well, because I think in the past people would say, we will do the minimum it takes to comply with today's laws. But I think organizations are seeing where things are moving to.
So why is this important in the accounting and finance context right now?
Couple of reasons. One is that when you're dealing with these kind of horizontal problems in organizations that are very vertically structured and siloed, when you're trying to solve a horizontal problem, who gets the budget? So I think from a finance perspective, how do we even fund some of these initiatives where potentially every group in an organization is going to be affected? But you've got the privacy team sitting there saying, hey, there's only 3 of us globally. We can't possibly, even if you gave us the budget, we don't have the skills and expertise necessarily to manage that budget. How do we get some of these things done? So I think there's from that perspective, but the other big piece of it as well is a lot of these laws are potentially impacting the way that organizations monetize data. So, you look at do not sell in California, for example, under CCPA. If your organization doesn't make money from selling data using their very broad definition, you may not be that impacted. But I was looking at a survey this morning where it said that, a high double-digit percentage of people may opt out of the data being sold. If that's your business, suddenly your revenue stream just got cut in half. That very much is a finance issue. So I think some of these things, it's being educated and informed about where are there potential restrictions on the way that we make money with personal data, and what can we do about those? How do we educate people that that's okay, or we're giving them a service in exchange for that data? And if that's not going to work, how are we then going to maybe, diversify the ways we make money? Or there's other kind of business challenges as well. So I think the first step will be being informed, but also then looking at particularly around these restrictions on the way that you can monetize personal data. Those are going to have in some cases, depending on the business model, a very, very significant impact.
And of course, data is now an asset, and accountants deal with assets all the time. So there is the added cost of being involved in managing that in a compliant and ethical way.
Yeah, it's funny that data as an asset concept comes up a lot, but you go and look at accounting standards. We've known how to manage fixed assets for over 100 years, right? We buy a building, we depreciate it, we have all these accounting policies and procedures. When I go into organizations and I say, well, tell me what your top 5 data assets are. Yeah, sometimes people can get 2 or 3. But then if you say, well, what's the value of those data assets? That's where people struggle, right? We don't really have good systems for valuing things. Intellectual property is kind of getting there. But if you go beyond that and say, what's the value of this, this CRM system with 1 million records in it? We don't really have the accounting frameworks there yet, at least as far as I know. And I haven't been an accountant for a number of years. But I think that's where we should be looking to accountants and people who are used to dealing with other asset classes and say, how do we value these things? Because the valuation then, right, you wouldn't put, $100 fence around a $10 cow. But if you don't know what the value of the assets are, how do you know what makes sense to spend to protect those assets? And I think that's where organizations struggle from a security perspective as well. You've got all of this data out there. And traditionally, we're looking at this data as being, we classify it as being sensitive or restricted, right? We've got these security controls we put in place over the different levels. But then if I say, well, an email address now could be a really big asset if we've got a lot of them, but we've classified that as being low sensitivity. How do you work in this new world where some of the paradigms we're used to have kind of been shifted? I think a lot of organizations just haven't done that analysis yet and really thought about, that discrepancy between traditionally what controls do we need to try and prevent a data breach versus what controls do we need to try and manage these valuable assets.
You mentioned in one of your earlier answers that organizations who don't make money under a very broad definition from data are unlikely to be affected by many of these rules. So which type of organization will be affected?
Any organization that has personal information will have to comply with a lot of these kind of the requests for tell me all the data, delete all my data on request. So there will still be some impact. But the ones that really go to the business model, that this concept of a data broker, which again sounds like a very narrow definition, but if you go and look at what do not sell means under the California definition, it's pretty much any exchange of data for valuable consideration that may or may not actually be financial. So there could be valuable consideration in, I give you my data for you to run a cloud service, and then you use that data to improve the service in some way, to do other things with it that go beyond just meeting my contract. If that's now considered valuable consideration, if somebody says to me, okay, don't sell my data, I've got to cut off some of those data streams that otherwise would flow. So I think people that are, when they've traditionally looked at a data set and said, and I think this is a very common way of thinking about it, if I have access to the data, I can pretty much do anything that I like. I think that paradigm as well is changing, and organizations where they've had the data and either they are selling it for money or they're turning it around and packaging it up or doing some enhancement to that data and then reselling it. Those models where the data is really the currency, that's where they may have to go and think, how much value can we get from the data if we anonymize it or we aggregate it? It might be less, but it might still allow us to do some of these things that otherwise could be turned off completely. So one of the things that I'm kind of working through with a couple of organizations is deletion of data is not binary. It goes between fully knowing everything you know about me individually through to, I know that some person came into the store and bought some socks, right? There's a whole range of different steps between those two areas, and each of them has some level of value and some level of risk. And I think organizations now are thinking about how often and how long do I need to keep all the data for, and how much value can I get out of part of the data, or some combination of those things. It's really another way of thinking about risk management that in the past, we haven't really thought about this because storage is so cheap these days. We'll just keep everything just in case. And in a lot of cases now, that doesn't really balance the risk and reward.
Certainly doesn't when you think about the penalties that things like GDPR can impose if companies get it wrong. We'll continue our conversation shortly as we find out more about cybersecurity, data privacy, and trust. All of that is coming up in this episode of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about the podcast and about the rest of our wider project at gobeyonddisruption.com. If you've just discovered us, and hello to you and to all of our regular listeners, remember to subscribe via your podcast app and have a browse through our other episodes too. There are lots of those to enjoy. Close to 100 conversations which focus on how technology is changing the profession, as well as how we as professionals are rising to the challenges, identifying opportunities and using our human intelligence to stay ahead of the curve. We're talking to Aaron Weller of Sentinel LLC about building a privacy culture to drive success. Aaron, how does an organization reform itself for a new privacy-first world? Is that where the idea of building a trust network becomes important?
Yeah, I think that the way that I consult to organizations about doing this is to really go back and think about, if you think about a set of data that you have as being kind of a sphere, and all of the commitments that you make, or the laws, or the contracts, or the commitments to your customers, things that your executives have said outside of the organization about things you will or won't do, all of those really carve out pieces of that potential value from that data set. And I think that if organizations are really thinking about taking privacy seriously, it's going back and saying, do we want to start off with just the legal requirements that we feel apply to us? Or do we want to kind of take this broader view and say, if we look at the totality of all of these commitments, what value can we still get from that data? Because one of the other things that I see is sometimes people are overcautious, right? I think we've talked a bit about people maybe not doing enough, and not actually complying or not meeting all of their existing commitments. But I've seen a lot of times where organizations have been overly cautious as well. And they've said, well, we're just not going to deal with this data at all. And I say to them, well, you realize that you can. There are certain controls and things you want to make sure you've got in place. But there's nothing legally or ethically that's really stopping you from doing this, as long as you're transparent and you're bringing the people whose data it is along with you. So that to me is where the kind of that starting point of building this, a network of trust, not just with your users, but also with kind of the other stakeholders as well. So really understanding, what do your employees think? A lot of organizations now are including some kind of trust or ethical perspective in their overall mission and values statements as the organization, not just as a team that's dealing with these things. So I find that fascinating that it's become enough of a hot topic that that's now an overall organizational goal to really be a trusted organization, and then potentially to be using that trust to then be able to have a better relationship that results in ultimately more revenue, more money coming out of those interactions.
So this is where companies have to start, basically. They start talking to their stakeholders.
It's understanding your stakeholders and then understanding kind of all of those different kinds of constraints as well. And really thinking about, how do you handle these things, right? If you're in an industry where there's a lot of privacy advocates who are out there saying, that the way you're using data is bad, how are you going to engage with those? You can't just ignore a lot of these groups that, maybe 10 years ago, you were like, yeah, that's on the fringe. No one really cares or listens to them. A lot of these groups now are actually sitting with lawmakers and putting their points forwards that then end up in legislation, right? The last thing you want to do is to be on the back foot where somebody else has written a law that you have to comply with. I think that's really where it's understanding, what is that end-to-end process? And to an extent, where do things like self-regulation fit into that overall picture, right? How does industries actually get together and put aside their differences to say, we want to do the right thing. Can we do that in a way that, potentially is an alternative to legislation in some circumstances.
So can you give us an example of something that you come across quite regularly about vulnerabilities that a company might have and how they would prioritize their actions when they find them?
From a vulnerability perspective, what you don't know is the thing that's going to hurt you, right? This is true in cyber. This is also true in when you're looking at the broader issues around privacy. So I think that the challenge is that most organizations don't know what data they have or where it is. And that was really, I think, a big wake-up call with GDPR and now CCPA, where organizations are saying, well, how do we go and find all of this data if we have like 100 different data stores? So vulnerabilities are often in where you're using tools that aren't designed with controls in them to really manage personal information. I saw this just last week where an organization that I work with has a lot of information in their email as that's the process. The way that this interaction is managed is through email rather than through a ticketing system where there's audit trails and a lot of other things that you'd expect. Those are the kind of things that from a privacy perspective could be vulnerable because you don't have the same level of control. So I think really getting that understanding of what information do we have and how do we use it is really a good first step to prioritize. And it's that while from a cyber perspective, we may have a good sense of what information we have, where it lives on the network, but we don't necessarily understand those business use cases. And I think that's one of the pieces where organizations really do have vulnerabilities because, like I said earlier, they may have a big data set. Someone has access to that, that they either download it, manipulate it, use it for something it wasn't intended to, or there's this whole issue around secondary use where in your privacy notice, it says you'll only do these two things with the data. Somebody has access to the data set and starts doing a third thing completely outside of any control.
I think that what the impression I'm getting from some of the things you're saying is that there's a lot of nervousness about doing the wrong thing when it comes to data privacy. And especially if you're quite a small organization, you may not have all this support in place that can help you make the right decision. Who normally sets up the systems and checks that they're ready to be handed over to the tech team to deal with in the future? Because if you're a small privacy team, that would be quite difficult to cope with.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, and that's what we saw with GDPR. There was a requirement that if you do certain things as an organization, you need to assign a data protection officer. And there were surveys that said that, 70,000 of these are going to be needed across Europe. And I can tell you that given the requirements for that role, there's no way that 70,000 people actually exist who could have been hired into those roles. So the way the market responded to that was a lot of the big law firms and consulting firms provided kind of fractional DPO services, so almost managed services agreements. And I'm seeing this again with a lot of the lead up to CCPA, which comes into effect in January next year, where organizations are saying, well, we've got a lot of customers, but we don't really know how many of them are going to exercise their rights. So we don't know how many people we need to hire to manage that process. So that's where, potentially managed service agreements may be a path forwards. But again, those come at a pretty big cost too. So if you're a small privacy team, I'm working with a couple of organizations where they have one person in their privacy team full time. And even large organizations may not have a very large privacy team. So as I was saying earlier, you've got this horizontal problem that affects a whole bunch of different things and often costs money, as you would expect, to fix a problem that affects a whole bunch of different teams. But you've got a privacy team that doesn't really have that ability to go and deliver against this all themselves. The idea or the way that I've described this in the past is you need privacy by collaboration. You need to have those relationships set up with other stakeholders inside the organization, your peers, executive management, and be able to raise these things and say, look, this is the problem. I can't address this problem as me, but I do need to know that this problem is being solved because of the fines and the other things we talked about earlier. So a lot of that gets bubbled up to executive level, and then, either more resources are assigned to the privacy team, or there's a collaboration across different teams to try and go and address that problem from a few different perspectives. Because, who sets the systems up and checks they're ready to be handed over, kind of from a privacy by design requirement. It could be that you've got a privacy team that can go and do a small amount of reviews, but you need to really build that thinking. Again, coming back to what I was saying earlier about the culture, what are the things that we should be looking for, and really those kind of almost issue spotting things to bubble those up to a small privacy team. So you need to kind of build that culture across the organization, much broader than the people who are dedicated to doing these things.
They're acting as, I suppose, your kind of force multipliers. They're giving you influence beyond your own role. Now, you mentioned that the CCPA legislation comes into force in January. What can people do before that? And where do they start? Because we're in October now. That's not a massive amount of time if you haven't started looking at how you're going to deal with this legislation.
Yeah, if you haven't started, it is the beginning of October, so that there's not much time left. But there are some things, if you go and read through the law or look at, there's a lot of analyses out there of kind of what do you do first. And I would advise to do the things first that are, publicly facing and very easy for people to see you're not doing, right? Go and look at your privacy notice. Make sure you've got the things in there that CCPA specifically requires certain language to be provided. It requires, to provide things like, what are the categories of data we have about people? What are the categories of organizations we share that data with? Because a lot of that is at the category level, it's something that, relatively quickly you could go and gather that information together, even if you haven't started doing it already. The other obvious thing would be to work out if you are in scope of this do not sell requirement. So do you meet that very broad definition that CCPA has of a sale? And if you do, you're going to need to provide a button on your website that says, do not sell my personal information. So those kinds of things where, you've got technical work that needs to be done, a change to the way that your homepage works. Sometimes that can take time, especially if you're in certain sectors where you're coming up on a moratorium, towards the end of the year where you're not going to make changes to live sites, making sure you get that stuff in early. Of course, the button is the tip of the iceberg, right? As soon as someone clicks the button, you then need to know what to do about it on the back end. But not having the button is probably an invitation to a lawsuit on January the 1st, because I would bet you that there will be people out there who are looking across all of the sites that serve Californians and saying, have they done the easy stuff, right? Have they changed their privacy notice? All that's really going to do is buy you a bit of time to then go and do some of the more complicated work on the inside. But those things should be up and running by January the 1st. And again, depending on your technology stack, that's potentially you could get those things in place by January. But I think you're still going to be managing a lot of the any inbound requests probably largely manually. So that could be a lot of work for a couple of months until you get a bit more sense of what are you actually doing, how can we automate some of these processes. But yeah, there are definitely things you can do even now.
So this is an opt-out system. You opt out of having your data sold on. You don't opt in to having it sold on. What are the risks of doing nothing?
At the moment, the way that CCPA is set up from a regulation point of view is that it will be regulated by the California State Attorney General. The law actually says that there will be no action taken until the middle of next year. But that doesn't mean that they can't take action against you for things that fail, in January, February, which is why I was saying that making sure that you can at least minimally comply from an external perspective is key to try and kind of head off some of those risks. I mean, the risks of doing nothing are that somebody they ask for all the data you have about them, or they look for the do not sell button and don't see it, and then they complain to the Attorney General. So the Attorney General, as you can imagine, is probably going to get a lot of complaints. So the risks of doing nothing are kind of a little bit proportional to how big an organization you are, how blatant it is that you're not complying with the law. The only piece of the law that does have a private right of action, so individual lawsuits, is around the breach piece right at the end. So there are already a lot of breach laws. This really just adds in a specific penalty if you have a data breach that meets the criteria that affects Californians. So that's also a risk as well, but there's also already a risk there in laws around data breaches. So what are the penalties for non-compliance? It's not like GDPR where there is a 4% potential fine. So that the penalties are going to be, sometimes it's going to be telling an organization they can't do something anymore. There are some specific monetary penalties around the breach piece, but a lot of the penalty is going to be, I think, bad publicity, and it's potentially going to be action taken against the organization. So the jury is still out a little bit on, how much of a disincentive is that? I think that part of it is going to be the risks of doing nothing, are partially that this is one of 50 states. 15 at least of which are already introducing legislation that has some commonalities with CCPA. So the risks of doing nothing just in California are only going to get, over time, more and more people are going to get some of these same rights. And the chances are that even if the California AG doesn't have time to actually come after one organization, one of these AGs in one of these states, if that's the way that they decide that the enforcement's going to work, is possibly going to come after you. And I would expect that we're going to see a lot of the other state laws are going to have broad private rights of action, where people can just start suing organizations that don't comply.
So is this going to impact any organization that has business dealings with organizations in California?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different. The way that they define the scope of the law is that it applies to California residents, and there's a certain minimum number of California residents. And it's really resident for tax purposes. So it's a little bit different from what you see with GDPR, where you have, you've got people in Europe, but maybe you don't have a physical presence in Europe. That could still happen under CCPA, but the definition's a little bit different because, if you've got people who live in another state and they're just in California briefly, I'm not a lawyer, but strictly speaking, you could argue that the way that they define the scope is narrow enough that you may be able to count out certain classes of people. But yeah, it's if you do deal with people in California, and it's above the minimum numbers that are mentioned in the law, then the chances are you should at least think about what would it take to comply. I do have clients where they looked at their databases and they have so few Californians, that it would seem like a disproportionate effort. But again, even in those scenarios, I would look back and say, if you did have to comply with another law, what would it take? Like, at least start doing the understanding of what data you have and where is it and how do we use it? Because the chances are that you're going to need that information. And it doesn't make sense until you've got a legal deadline breathing down your neck to start that work. And
it looks like you're prepared. It looks like you're taking it seriously, and you've taken steps to at least establish what your exposure is on that front.
Exactly. And for the auditors in the audience, you probably well know that the best way to convince an auditor to start digging deeper is looking like you don't know what you're doing. if you have a good story and you can kind of say, look, this is the process and this is it, even if you don't get it perfect, because, getting it perfect is really, really hard and not everyone agrees on what perfect is. At least looking like you're trying and at least looking like you're doing the right thing, gets you a long way.
Done is better than perfect.
Done is better than perfect. Absolutely.
Now, our typical listener likes to keep ahead of everybody else. So help us out. From your perspective and experience, what do you think is the next disruption coming along?
Well, one of the things, and I don't know how realistic this will actually happen, but one of the things we've started to see is this idea around people owning their personal data and being able to monetize it themselves. I think that would be a very big disruption to, again, a lot of the assumptions we have around, if I gather your personal data, it's then kind of mine and I can do whatever I want with it within the constraints of the privacy notice that I agreed with you. I think if any of these laws get passed that are moving towards, giving people even broader rights over their personal information, it's going to be disruptive because it challenges kind of the way we think about how businesses work. So I think that's going to be a lot of the other laws that I would expect are going to happen, both at a state and federal level in the US, the reform of PIPEDA in Canada, which is the federal law in Canada around privacy. A lot of the other laws, they're really kind of variations off of GDPR as kind of being the template for, giving people more transparency in these data subject rights. I mean, they're disruptive in themselves, but I think the next big disruption is going to be either something that happens like that, or it's going to be something more societal around, let's say that augmented reality becomes cheap enough and mass used enough that suddenly everyone's walking around with, the ability to facially recognize anyone on there, even if you just say they're LinkedIn contacts. that's just going to change the way society works, just like social media did. So I think from a legal perspective, the laws around kind of thinking about, how do we actually think about who owns the data, could be potentially disruptive. But I continue to see organizations that are looking at, augmented reality to do everything from, helping to repair an engine where you could kind of see an exploded diagram of all of the parts kind of almost at a heads up display in front of you. There's so many different things that I see augmented reality be able to do. And the technology is getting down to the price point where I think there's a lot of ways it could be used, but society is not really used to it. Remember when Google Glass first came out a few years ago, people were horrified that, potentially you could be recording them all the time. And I think those are the things where the big disruptions are probably going to be some kind of technology that then becomes commonplace, and society's really got to think about, what does that mean for privacy? What does that mean about how I interact with other people? I think those are the interesting things, and that's really why I'm excited to be in the privacy space, because there is so much that's changing that there are always new problems to solve.
You mentioned something which sounded sci-fi earlier in your answer about people monetizing their own data. And I remember reading an article about 5 years ago where there was a woman who was actually doing that as an experiment, and she registered herself as a company in Delaware, and she was doing it to maximize the amount that she could gain from whatever data anyone was taking from her. So it's not quite as far-fetched as listeners might think.
Yeah, I wouldn't quit your day job and assume that that's actually going to pay the mortgage. But it's an interesting concept, and I've seen a few startups lately that have this idea, particularly with CCPA and kind of the do not sell my data laws, that they think that there is kind of the flip side of that is, well, don't sell my data unless I make some money out of it. So I do think there is room for innovation in that space, but the challenge with a lot of these things has always just been scale. How do you get them to be widely enough adopted that people assume that that's kind of the way that it works? I think there'll always be a subset of the population that will go to the level of effort of the person that you just described. But I think most people, honestly, they would like to make money out of their data if it doesn't really make much effort for them to go and do it. So I think there could be a tipping point where if it's made easy enough with something that's broadly adopted enough, potentially that could change things.
Well, that could be my next project. Now, speaking of what's coming up next, where can people catch you? What's on your calendar at the moment?
I'm speaking to the Washington Bar in November about data ethics, which will be interesting. We've had to do a lot of research, and we've got an interesting panel on how do you think about ethically using data. I always come back to the Jeff Goldblum quote from Jurassic Park about just because your scientists were so preoccupied with what they could do, they didn't stop to think if they should. And I think a lot of the ways that people use personal information kind of fall into that they're using them in a lot of innovative ways, but are we really using that information ethically? So that's coming up in November. I'm potentially speaking at the big IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals conference in DC next year around getting some more quantifiable ways of managing risk. And then I've got a presentation next year in Las Vegas in 2020 around really thinking about how do we kind of have a range between your identity and then your privacy. What are ways where someone can say, that they can get the answer to a query like, am I old enough to drink alcohol, without really looking at my driver's license and seeing all of that other information. So how do you get responses to questions that could impact privacy, but give a very narrow response, and that's tied back to a unique identity. So that's something else my team's working on, and I think that's an interesting topic too, because similar to what we were just saying about monetizing your data, identity is a really big problem where we all have so many individual identities that really getting to how do we manage our own identities across work and school and home. That for me is a super interesting topic, because we may not be the same people in all of those different bits of identity. So I think managing that is an ongoing challenge.
Now, before we wrap up, where can people find more information about these subjects? What resources would you recommend that they look at?
The IAPP, as I mentioned earlier, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, has some really good resources. I think a lot of the other professional associations do as well, because as I said, privacy touches across so many different areas that really there are, a lot of organizations, whether it's the AICPA or ISACA, who have members who are interested in the topic, and they produce some good resources too. It would probably be remiss of me not to mention my own website, which is cultureofprivacy.com, where we post some things around kind of how I'm thinking on these particular topics. But I think with privacy being so much in the news these days, there's a lot of good resources. I mean, I also use Twitter and LinkedIn as kind of keeping my finger on the pulse of what everyone else is talking about, because often I find news breaking there that I wouldn't see through other channels. So I would recommend those too.
Finally, what's one actionable suggestion that you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that will help them go beyond disruption?
For me, I would come back to the question we talked about earlier with, do you know what the biggest data assets are for your organization, and how are they valued? And if they're valued as being, a large percentage of the value of the company, what are you guys doing to protect them? What's being done to monetize them, right? Do you have, even from a finance perspective, I think trying to push on it from that direction, where you're looking at the financial implications of not doing the right thing, particularly as we were talking earlier with some of these large fines. It's an interesting angle, and one that when I've got into conversations with finance professionals can be really interesting, where they haven't really understood, some of what it takes to do this on a day-to-day basis. But finance professionals can often be a key ally for privacy professionals, because they're trying to manage all of this risk and all of this potential lost value. But as I said earlier, that they often don't get the amount of funding that groups that have been around for a bit longer do. So I think there's definite potential for partnership there.
It's an ongoing issue, and it looks like it's going to be occupying us for many years to come. Erin Weller, Vice President of Strategy for Sentinel LLC, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered, and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to, and assume no responsibility for, the content or application of the material contained herein, and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.